All right, it looks like we're live. So, Rabbi Geoff, thank you for coming on and being willing to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. So my name's Rabbi Geoff Mitelman. I am the founding director of an organization called Sinai and Synapses, which bridges the worlds of religion and science.
Awesome. So you pronounce your name Jeff, is that
Yeah,
correct?
Jeff. Yeah, it's the British spelling.
Okay, yeah, I got that. I thought it was Geoff, so that was my
I
apologies.
get that every so often too.
Yeah. All right, so I saw your video on the Templeton Foundation, I believe, where you
Mhm.
talked about how we should talk about and think about God. So could you tell us a little bit about your perspective there? Because I normally start my conversations by saying I'm an atheist, by which I mean there's no reason to believe in a God. And could you tell us a little bit about what reasons you think there are for belief in a God?
Sure. I would start by saying I don't think that there is necessarily a reason to believe or not to believe in God. I think it's a different question, because one line that I use all the time is that all theology is really autobiography. What we say about God has much more to say about us than it says about God. And so one Jewish thinker who talks a lot about God is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who talks about that in Judaism we talk about the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob is different than saying the God of truth, beauty, and goodness, or the God of these kinds of philosophical gods. That in fact that I experience God and think about God much more in a relational sense than a philosophical and physical kind of sense.
So how would that differ from, for example, the classical Christians like William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga, how they view God? What is the difference between their interpretation of how they view a relationship with God and how you do?
So I need to know a little more about how you would describe their view of God.
So I believe their view of God is that there is this personal being who is eternal, all powerful, all knowing, conscious, all good, and who directly interacts with the world and literally did most of the stuff in the Bible, or in some general sense, as opposed to like the young earth creationists. And they think that they have a personal relationship and can directly communicate, and it communicates back, and they can have conversations and such. And that there are these philosophical arguments that can indicate and give us good knowledge of this God and what its properties are.
Yeah, that is very much not how I view God. And I think that's a big difference between the way Judaism thinks about God and Christianity thinks about God in a variety of different ways. Um, so look, there's a Yiddish expression that says, "If I knew God, I'd be God." So a lot of this has to come in my mind with tremendous humility and epistemic humility of recognizing that I am a finite human being and whatever I say is limited by my finitude. And so coming in to say, I am absolutely sure there is a God, or I'm absolutely sure there is not a God, or those kinds of questions, um, to me come off as kind of hubristic, and to be able to say I know for sure one way or another. I would describe myself as as an agnostic theist, because in my mind agnosticism and theism are almost perpendicular here. So for me, I have an experience of God. I have a way of which I think about God, the ways in which I uh, in my mind, try to bring more of godliness into this world, but I would not say I know for sure one way or another. So it sounds like it would be quite radically different from what you were describing just a few moments ago.
So, what is your experience of God?
So there are a few different ways in which I think about it and talk about it. And I'm going to say in advance that it's not necessarily going to be totally philosophically consistent. Because again, uh, all theology is autobiography. In my mind, if my view of God has not changed since I've grown, it means that I've not grown, that I've become very static. And I think that's problematic because as human beings, we grow and we learn. And if I'm not willing to say, you know what, let me rethink what this might be, then I'm not growing in this world. So the question that I like to think about, I don't like to ask who is God or what is God, because that comes at it from a very intellectual, philosophical perspective. Because you can then say, let me show you reasons to believe, or let me show you reasons not to believe. And it becomes I think, a very interesting intellectual argument, but it's not at the level in which I'm thinking about it. For me, so the question is not who is God or what is God. For me, the question is when is God? When are there moments in which someone would feel something that they would use to describe an experience of God? So, which again is a long way to be able to say that, but in the moment of having tremendous awe and wonder and majesty, when I went to the Grand Canyon, for example, which is a little bit trite, but that's one that a lot of people go to, there is a sense of my feeling something very small in the midst of a tremendous vastness, or thinking about the universe being 13.8 billion years old and how tiny bit of a slice humanity has been. And boy, we are kind of insignificant in the large scale of the cosmic universe. That creates a level of awe and wonder and majesty. But I also feel divinity and I feel God when I am with my family, when I am with my children, when I see them learn, when I see them grow. I bless my children. My wife and we bless our children on Shabbat every Friday night. We light the Shabbat candles, and we start by actually giving tzedakah. We give a little bit of charity, and then we light the Shabbat candles, and we sing, and we put our hands on their head, and we give them a blessing, and we give each other hugs and kisses. And it's a absolutely wonderful, transcendent moment for me. And I feel God in that moment. Can I come up with philosophical reasons of how is God acting in this kind of way? No, I that's not something that's not in my mind at that moment. I am fully present in the moment. And that's when I would use, for me, language I would use to talk about God that others may not, but that's at least my language that I would use.
So why is awe and wonder associated with God as opposed to just being an emotion or a biological function of the brain? Why are these things that we experience, why do you call them a God or an experience of a God?
So I think they are the root of a description of God. And so again, Rabbi Heschel says that awe is the root of faith, and that we praise before we can prove. And so almost everyone in my mind, if I were to say, think about a moment when you felt awe or wonder, but not going to bring in the God conversation here, but think about a moment when you felt awe or wonder. That's a very generative conversation. Anyone can at least step into that conversation. They may not have had a moment of awe or wonder, but they can talk about it in a variety of different ways. For me, because I'm rooted in my Jewish language, that allows me to express that level of awe and majesty and wonder. It gives me language to be able to talk about it that I wouldn't have had otherwise. Otherwise, I would have just gone, I've been speechless. But when I was at the Grand Canyon, for example, I was speechless, and the only thing that could come to my mind was a verse from the book of Psalms that says, "Ma gadlu ma'asechaya," how great are your works, O God, how wondrous your designs. Now, do I believe that God created the Grand Canyon to be able to experience in that kind of way? No, I believe that, and I don't think this is not I believe, this is what happened. The Colorado River cut into the Arizona desert over millions of years, and it created the wonderful rocks and the light playing, and that's what happened. But without having that religious language, I would not have been able to express it. And again, my view of God is how I connect or relate to God in that kind of way.
How is that different from an atheist, for example, like Richard Dawkins, who goes and sees the Grand Canyon, and he also experiences the awe and wonder of looking at it, but he uses different language, more just like chemical processes in the brain, or this is just such a cool feeling. Would you say he's also experiencing God in some sense?
I would let him decide what language he would want to use for that. I feel very uncomfortable saying to an atheist, you actually believe in God, because you identify however you identify, in the same way that I'm sometimes called an atheist. And I'm like, no, I'm not. So I would say that we would have a similar kind of experience, I think that we could be able to talk about it much more constructively starting from that conversation than is there a God? Is there not a God? That's going to degenerate instantly. But to be able to, for me to be able to hear how does he talk about that level of awe and wonder, that allows me to then hear what he's talking about. And if he's interested in hearing, I can then talk how I'm talking about it. And so it becomes a more constructive conversation. So if he says, yes, I feel God in this moment, that's the language he would use. If he doesn't, then he doesn't. And I think it's very valid to be able to talk about it in different kinds of ways.
So the sense of awe and wonder, is that synonymous with a God? And if we didn't
Yeah.
feel that, would God
No.
be not existing, or what's the difference?
No, it's definitely because you can feel awe without necessarily talking about God in the same way that you can be a decent human being without needing God. I think that you can absolutely be a moral human being without God, without a doubt. Um, Again, it's the root, as Heschel said, it's the root. So it manifests itself, and the branches are going to be very different for different people here. But again, the root becomes the way we talk about it, and it's the flowering that we can then discuss and say, oh, it's interesting. You came at it from that branch. I'm coming at it from this branch. That's interesting. I didn't know that. Oh, well, here's actually maybe we're actually two different twigs on the same branch, and I wasn't even aware of that. I thought you were a totally different tree. I thought you were an animal, right? This we can at least start from a place of commonality, and then the disagreements become very different than attack and counterattack.
So what are these branches? Because you said we have part of the same tree, but different branches on the same tree. So what is the tree and what are the branches?
Um, I would say that the sense of awe and wonder, and I would also say the other area in which for me, I experience God is for lack of a better word, love, but maybe connection or deep relationship. That's another way where there's a root that can flower itself in different ways. So for some, that's going to manifest itself in religious language. Absolutely. And for some, it's not. But I would think that if I were to go to an atheist research scientist and say, tell me why you're studying whatever you're studying, they're probably not going to go, it's pretty boring. I hate it. I mean, they may say that if they're, depending on where they are in their doctorate. But if I were to really tap into their emotional piece of that, they'll have language to be able to speak about it. And they can talk about awe and wonder. And they may then have different language to talk about God than what I would say. In Judaism, there's an idea that there are, I believe it's 70 different names for God. And the way that we talk about God is really different kinds of roles. So for me, I'm a male, I'm a father, I'm a rabbi, I'm an entrepreneur, I love science, I'm a Yankee fan, or I've got all these different things. So when I go to Yankee Stadium, I'm not necessarily thinking about my Talmudic questions that I'm grappling with. I'm cheering on Aaron Judge. That's because it's a different role in that way. And yet there are pieces where my love for baseball has influenced the way that I think about my Judaism. And so, because I'm all Geoff, right? Like that's it. It comes back from who I am. But I'm also influenced. I am a different person now as a father than I was 10 years ago. I'm a different person because I'm married to my wife for 8.5 years at this point. I'm different than what I was there. The relationships also change me in the way we think about God can be different based on different names. So that's another way of thinking about the different flowering that can come out.
So you said that the sense of awe is how we get to know God or the source of God, but you're saying the sense of awe isn't synonymous with God. There's some difference between the two. Could you explain a little bit about what the difference is? Because from my perspective, the way you've described it is that when we talk about God, what we're talking about is those feelings in some sense. So what is the difference exactly?
Um, I think it's hard to be able to describe. It's not something that I can necessarily articulate. But it is Um, let me phrase it this way. I think there's a difference between religion and God, right? So I think no one would doubt that religion is a human invention, and it's a human attempt to be able to understand and talk about God. So maybe the way that I would think about this is that there's, for me, this is the awe experience, which then gets expressed in religious language. That is how I connect with God and feel God in this kind of way, if that makes sense. So, and for others, it's the awe experience, and for others, it's purely emotional and scientific. Some, it's feeling it and not having language for it. So for different people, it may ultimately connect to God, and for some people, it may not. But for me, it's that awe experience, which then gets expressed in religious language, which is how I think about and talk about and conceptualize my experience and relationship with God.
So, for example, when the atheist has those same experiences, but they don't see that being connecting, or they don't use religious language to connect it to a god, or, for example, if someone of a different religion says they have other experiences and talk about the Hindu gods or the Muslim gods or Buddhism and Jainism and all those other different religions, how is their conception of a god and yours different in some sense?
Purely culturally defined. Which is, again, there's a difference between God and religion. So the way the language they would use is different than the language I would use. But another analogy that I particularly like is the difference between language and languages. Right, so everybody speaks language. We as human beings need language, and the purpose of language is to communicate. Right? That's why it exists. But nobody speaks language. You and I are speaking English. If we were to be in France, we'd be speaking French. If we were in Japan, we'd be speaking Japanese. But we would still be communicating. Right? The goal would be to be able to share ideas and implant ideas in each other. Similarly, there are certain experiences, love, awe, majesty, all the different pieces that for some people, that language is going to be Jewish. For others, it's going to be Christian. For others, it's going to be Southern Baptist. For some, it's going to be United Methodist. For some, it's going to be atheistic, right? There's going to be, or maybe secular humanism. I think that's probably a better, I think there are a couple of people like Michael Shermer and Neil deGrasse Tyson. I think it's very true of one of the problems of saying atheist is you're saying what you're not versus what is your actual philosophy, which might be secular humanism, right? That's so it might be secular humanist language. But they're all designed to be able to say the same thing. They're all be able to say, I want to talk about these kinds of experiences in a way that's meaningful for my community. So my expression is going to be Jewish, which is going to be different from the way other people would express it.
So, are they wrong and you're right? Is Yahweh like the one true God and their interpretation is incorrect, or do you see it differently than that?
I see it differently than that. I definitely see it differently than that. I don't. Again, I have no additional knowledge of God than you do. Right? I have no more. I have probably more internal knowledge about Jewish life and Jewish living. I think that I would probably know knowledge about a little bit more about what the Jewish language would look like. But in terms of knowing who or what God is, I am no closer to God than you are, and no closer than anyone else is. So, and again, if I were to say that, I think that would be an incredibly arrogant statement. And so, I think that religion is a human attempt to be able to give language to things that are greater than ourselves. So, I would say that I'd be curious to know how and talk about how they think about or talk about God or their gods or no gods. Right? I think that's a very interesting question there. But I would not say that we're right, you're wrong. God for excuse about God forbid. I would say that.
So is there anything we can specifically say about God? Are there any properties that we know he has or properties we know he doesn't have? Like, for example, do we know he's conscious as opposed to being pantheistic kind of a thing where he's just a part of the universe, a fundamental essence kind of a thing?
Again, it depends on what you mean by no, right? So if you're thinking about it from, do I know that this computer in front of me is real? I don't know. It's not real in that kind of way. Um, is it real in the way that love is real? That's a different kind of question. Because what you're looking for love is different than what I would be looking for love. And yet there's an experience of love. Like, you know, when you're feeling loved and you know when you're not feeling loved. And that's very real for, you know, as much as that can be. So are there any philosophical ways to be able to say what we know what God is? No, I would say no. Um, are there ways in which we can, if we so choose, use language to talk about God to describe some of our feelings? Yes.
So would you use language to describe God as being essentially a conscious mind independent of our own, something that exists out there? Or would that not be language you'd use?
That probably is not. So I'd phrase it this way: it probably is not language that I personally would use, but it also would not be inconsistent with my thinking. So if somebody were to say that, I if somebody were to say that to me and were to say like, oh wow, that's an interesting way to think about that, let me integrate that into my theology, I could see that potentially happening, but it's not part of my theology right now.
Would you say the same thing about the Jains or the Buddhists who talk about God in kind of a essence or a fundamental essence of the universe, where it's not specifically conscious, it's more of like just the real way the universe is, kind of a thing, like karma?
um it's not, again, it's not language that I would necessarily use, and again, I would not want to speak for other people's language. I feel comfortable talking about. I actually not even comfortable talking about purely Jewish. I mean, I can talk about my experience here, but um, the tagline that we use for Sinai and Synapses is scientifically grounded and spiritually uplifting. And we start with what is the best, most accurate science that we have about our world today. And one line, now I'll quote someone from a different religious tradition, which is the Dalai Lama, who said, if science were to come forward and violate Buddhist teachings, we need to change Buddhist teachings. And I think that needs to happen for all religions. Um, I am going to start with universe is 13.8 billion years old. Climate change is real. Vaccinate your kids. Right? Evolution is true. That those are things that's I'm sorry. And so now my religion and my religious worldview has to be shifted and changed by that. Right. So because if I say, well, look, God created the universe and let me spin this out here, then that's, to me, that's not a helpful way to actually understand the way the world works. I need to start with, what is the science saying the actual world works? What are some things that we may not be able to know? And what are some things that are simply unknowable? Um, and that's, and I think it's important to be able to draw those kinds of distinctions there.
Well, you mentioned earlier that you said, when I asked, saying God as a conscious being would not be inconsistent with the language that you would use or your world perspective. Would saying God is not a conscious being, more like the karma thing, would that be inconsistent with your language?
No, that could also be consistent too.
Okay.
I think there's, Judaism tends to generally have a pretty flexible theology, not as flexible as other religions, but it tends to be more flexible than the other Abrahamic faiths, because Judaism's focus is predominantly on how do we make this world better here and now, and it is a religion predominantly of, people would say, orthopraxis rather than orthodox. Its focus is much more on legislating action than belief.
All right. So suppose like an asteroid was coming and hit the Earth and all humans died. Would God still exist outside of that, or would God cease to exist?
again, this is my own theology, which again is my own autobiography, and I have no way of proving this one way or another, right? So this is, I would say that God, if there is a God independent of human beings, would continue to exist, and yet human expression to talk about God would be lost. So God may exist, but we wouldn't have access to that knowledge of God. It's almost like if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, would it make a sound? And you answer that question depending on however you answer that question. So, in my mind, God would still exist, but our manifestations and descriptions of God would be very different, and the language we would use would be very different if language continued to exist.
So, is God synonymous with existence in the universe, or is God something separate?
I tend to be more of a religious naturalist. I have trouble relating to a God that is beyond who we are, beyond the natural realm. So I tend to be a religious naturalist, and experienced through the natural world. That also includes the universe as we know it, right? So not just Earth and life, but that there's different pieces of that. So that's that's in the same way that there's Steven Pinker, who I like a lot of his work, talks about, I think it's in Enlightenment Now, that the universe tends to go towards chaos, right? The second law of thermodynamics says that and for human beings, there's a lot more that can go wrong than go right, right? So things have to go right to be able to be a human being. And so when something bad happens to someone and they go, why did God let this happen? Which is, there's also, if you haven't seen the Book of Mormon, which is one of the most brilliant plays ever and incredibly theologically sophisticated. At the end of Act 1, I'm not giving too much away, something bad happens and one of the actors says, Heavenly Father, why do you let bad things happen? More to the point, why do you let bad things happen to me? You're like, oh, how could God allow all this horribleness in the world? Well, that's not actually what you're asking. What you're really asking is, why did God allow this bad thing happen to me? And the answer is the universe is going to make bad things happen, right? There's a lot more that can go wrong than go right. Why not you? And so my view of God is not that, okay, God's going to swoop in and change us, that the way that we can grow and the way we bring more of God into this world is through human beings and through human action.
So you said you're a religious naturalist. What does that mean? Is it that something different than most religious people, or is that like saying that there's no like supernatural realm?
It's essentially saying that there is not that God is not supernatural. God is part of the natural universe, part of the natural world there.
But it's not all the natural. It was only part of it. So there's some.
No, I would include all of the natural. I would say about all of the natural world there as well.
Okay, so God could include all of the natural world.
Yes, I think so.
You mentioned earlier that Judaism was less strict than the other religions. What are some of the things that it is more strict about?
So it tends to be much more strict about practice, about how you're supposed to do things. So there are at least, and whether people actually do it in this way changes from movement to movement and person to person. I don't observe it exactly the way as described, but for example, lighting Shabbat candles, which I do with my family. There's a certain time when you are supposed to light the Shabbat candles, and you do it by this particular time, and then you can then you do Havdalah, which ends Shabbat. You do that at a certain time. You to celebrate certain holidays, you need to do certain things at certain times in certain ways. There are certain things that you are supposed to eat and not eat, and there are certain things. So there's and that I think is for many Jews an expression of a love for God, And that these are things that are that bring people closer to God in that kind of way. And then there are some who do it and they don't necessarily experience the divine doing this work, but it's much more in the Torah. It says when the Torah was given, the Torah was given to the Israelites, and the answer was, they said, "Will you do this?" And the Israelites answered, "Na'aseh v'nishma," which means we will do and we will hear. Which sometimes takes, I'll do it and then I'll understand why I do it, which is the opposite of the way most moderns do it, right? They think about, okay, do I want to do this? Let me think about this. And then, all right, maybe I'll do this. And if I do, then I'll try it, but maybe I won't like it. And then I'll see and I'll try it. And Judaism is like, no, you're going to do it. And you're going to see how you feel and see what does it actually impact your life. And you're going to do it X number of times. You may do it your whole life. For some people, you do it for your whole life. But I also encourage people to do it for a month or 2 months or whatever it is. And then reflect on it and see how did this change your life in some way, where there are emotions that came in, which is a very different way of thinking than I think a lot of philosophers and most of the other religious traditions.
Very different, yeah. So how do you interpret, like, for example, in the Torah, the things like the talking bush or the talking donkey, the talking snake, and how do you think, when you mentioned that the Torah was given, what does that mean exactly to say that the Torah was given?
That's a very complicated question, and a really good question. So look, where I come from, I think the Torah was written by human beings. I think it's pretty obvious from a variety of different reasons. They were human attempts to be able to understand God, and human descriptions of how we want the Israelites and then later the Jews to connect to God. And so the stories are there as part of different narratives and cultural stories, but the way that the Torah is not read, the Torah is studied, and it's looked at and pored over and connected to, and it's not clear, right? So one wonderful example is in the story of Noah. It says that at the end of pieces, Noah was righteous. He was blameless in his generation. And that's the Hebrew of Bedorotav. And the rabbis love this of when there's something that's extraneous, they're like, oh, that must mean something. So they talk about, oh, Noah was righteous in his generation. Well, it doesn't need to say in his generation. Was he righteous or wasn't he righteous? And you can make two arguments on this. If he was righteous in his generation, if you think about the generation of the flood was pretty atrocious. So compared to everyone else, he was good, but actually he was a pretty terrible human being. Or think about when you're surrounded by jerks, it's very easy to be a jerk yourself. But Noah was righteous even in that generation. Even when he was surrounded by violence and horribleness, he was able to be a righteous human being. So which is it? Was he righteous or wasn't he righteous? And the answer is yes, right? You can make a legitimate argument both ways on this. And so the Torah is not, okay, let me read it from the beginning to end and see this is going to dictate how my life is going to be. There's a process, and you read it in study and you read it in conversation, because you can be able to glean lessons from it. And it also, while the text doesn't change, we change. And what we learn from it changes from one generation to the next.
Do you take it literally as like Noah actually existed, or there are some, like, how much of it do you take literally? Is there some parts of it that are more figurative?
What do you mean by literal?
Like, did Noah actually exist as a human being like us, and the world was literally flooded with water, and the burning bush, there was actually a bush that spoke to...
No, to me that did not, like, was there a DVR that had those things? No, in my mind, no. That's now, is it true that somebody wrote down those stories and passed those on and became important touchstones for thousands of years? Yes, that's also indisputable. But yes, no, I think it's in the same way that how do you read the opening verses of Genesis, right? So here's another example of this that I talk about a lot. I don't think the universe was created in 7 days. I think it's pretty clear it did not. And I also don't like if you read the Bible in the right way, it actually was 1,000,000 years. And this was that's also a little bit doesn't work for me because it's designed to be poetry, right? You don't read poetry to be literal, right? Life is like a bowl of cherries. No, it's not. Life is not like a bowl of cherries. Well, no, that you're getting a different statement there. So what is the message of design to be talking about with the creation story? So the creation story ends every day with, in Hebrew, Vayera Vayivoker, which translates as there was evening, there was morning. But there's another, they could play with the words on this. So Erev is actually potentially connected to the word chaos. The word Erev comes up in a couple places in the Torah as sort of a mixed multitude. So it could be chaos. And Boker could potentially be connected to the word of livaker, which means to distinguish. Or you could think of being able to order, right? This is here and that was there. So it could be that every day of creation is saying there was chaos and then there was order. First day, there was chaos and then there was order, which is the reverse of the way the universe actually works, right? The word goes from order to chaos. So why does the text say from chaos to order, from chaos to order? Well, the only way you can go from chaos to order is to consciously do that, to be able to say, I want to clean up my kitchen. I want to be able to heal people. I want to be able to create more order in this world. The message of the Genesis story and the opening verses of creation is to be able to say, the universe is naturally going to go from order to chaos. God aimed to be able to help us move from chaos to order, and we have to act like God in that way to be able to move from chaos to order.
So, for example, do you say when the Torah was given, is that essentially the sense of awe that people had at the time inspired them to write the Torah, and that was how it was given to them, essentially?
I mean, I have to think. I haven't really fleshed that out enough to be. I mean, this is the first time sort of thinking about that, but I would say, with the 45 seconds I've been able to think about that, I would say that's close enough to what I would believe. I could, think about it more and flesh it out, but that would probably be close enough.
So would that also apply to other religious texts like the Bhagavad Gita and the Christian text and the Mormon text and those kinds of things?
For me, from where I sit, that's how I would describe it as sort of an academic. They would have a different internal description of it. And so, but I also think that there would be some who could have multiple different hats, to be able to read it from an internal perspective and to be able to understand, this was written at a particular time for a particular reason here.
Well, how would you take the interpretation of, for example, the young earth creationists who interpret their version of God as literally creating the world 6,000 years ago and the world being created in 7 days? I mean, so you said that would not necessarily, you wouldn't agree with that from your language and perspective.
Right.
But their language and perspective, it's still kind of a valid way to describe God from their perspective, you would say?
Well, so I think, and again, I am not a young earth creationist and I'm not an expert in young earth creationism. But from what I understand, they start from a place of theology and accepting God and seeing the Bible as the literal word of God as it was written, and then spin everything out after that. I come at it from the other angle. I come at it from what is the science saying, and how can I change the way that I experience God, talk about theology, and read the Bible. So it's a different starting point there.
So how do you interpret things like the afterlife and if it's like Sheol? Is that the middle ground?
Yeah, it's described in the Torah. Yeah, I have no idea. That's my cop out, right? Like no one's ever come back. So my own theology is that we live on through the memories of the people that we love and the stories that we tell and the impact that we leave on the world.
So like the heaven, so angels and heaven and Lucifer and all of that could be more of the figurative side of the Torah?
Yeah, and that's more Christian than Jewish, at least in terms of the way. So the angel, an angel in Judaism is not necessarily somebody up on heaven. An angel actually literally means a messenger. And so I I don't know, and I certainly don't know. I mean, I can talk about my own belief system, but the short answer is that it's my own belief system. I have no idea. Um, but
What
I
is
don't.
what is your own belief system
Oh,
on this?
say it again.
What is your own belief system on this?
That when we die, we're dead, right? Like that's like our body dies, um, and the way that our memory lives on is is through friends and family, like the genetics that we pass on from one generation, the stories that we tell, and the impact that we had on the world when we died.
So, what would be your perspective on suppose there is another planet with another alien race, and would you say that they also had a similar relationship to God as we do, and something about awe and wonder? And what if they didn't have awe and wonder?
Then they would have different language. They would have different and different emotions, right? Emotions are also human, so and emotions are evolutionary adaptive, evolutionarily adaptive, right? There's a reason that evolution had us have a sense of awe, and people are studying that and grappling with that. So again, it is totally historical and ultimately culturally based. And would aliens have a culture? What would that look like? And it would be influenced by what their physiology looked like and what their biochemistry looked like. And so I don't know but what they would think and feel and talk about would be very different than what we human beings would have.
Or say, for example, an artificial intelligence. Suppose we actually made an artificial intelligence. How
Yeah.
would you see that as relating to the idea of God? Would it have some conception or some relationship in some way?
That's a good question, and it's a hard question that a lot of people are grappling with, and I don't know the answer to that question. So the because there's an element of consciousness, um, and in some ways we view our technology as godlike, right? We view Google as all knowing in a lot of different ways, and and so someone actually talked about, and I can't even remember how it was, but the different. I think it was Google, Facebook, Amazon, and another one are actually come out and the different parts of our brain and different parts of our body. That the Google is our brain, and I wish I could remember this in a lot of ways, but I don't think that artificial intelligence is going to be conscious in the way that we are, um, because of the idea of questioning and wondering. Like we don't. I could be wrong on this, but Google is great if you know what question you're asking, but we've got to be able to ask the question. And there's also a level of human connection that is always going to be needed as human beings. So those are pieces in which I don't think that artificial intelligence will replace God. Now, it may change the language that we talk about God, but at least that's my take on it.
Do you think there could be multiple gods, kind of like a polytheism, or is it limited to one?
Um, Again, my theology is no, but that doesn't mean that I'm right. That's um, one one reason that in Judaism they talk about one God is that, first of all, it was about this idea of there was one God and not many gods in the polytheistic culture. But it also implies there is a oneness to who we are. There's a unity to ourselves, and to me, I find that very beautiful. That there's a unity to humanity. There's a unity to the universe. So my experience and my talk about God is influenced by trying to find a level of unity.
So what exactly does when you say we ourselves have a unity? Does that mean each individual has a unity, or our culture has a unity,
So
or
no, I think that we have a lot of therapy happens to help people feel unified, right? Feel a sense of integrity, and that's because we have multiple competing emotions and needs and wants, and our brain is multiple different modules there, and trying to be able to say, I have a sense of a unified sense of self. It may be a fiction, but it's a unified sense of self and a level of integrity. But also, I am part of the larger human family, right? There is one human family that is part of who we are. So there's a unity to the human race in my mind. And so that's also a large part of it. And I am connected to the stars that exploded billions of years ago, right? There's a unity there's a reason that we call it universe. Now, if there's a multiverse, that creates some complicated questions also. But there is a at least from what we understand, there is a unity to this, to our lives and to humanity and the world as a whole.
Well, you mentioned awe and wonder as being the inspiration to God. Are other emotions also inspirations to God? Would negative emotions be connections to a God in the same way as awe and wonder?
Sure. Yes, I think so. But I think um, that the negative emotions are great as a short-term motivator, but for a long-term questions and relationships, you need the positive elements of it.
So, for example, like, could you say that, like, you get the example of the Grand Canyon, how you saw awe and wonder, and you quoted the quote you gave. I forget what it was exactly, but could someone go to the opposite end and see like a lot of great deal of pain and suffering and say, well, I see God in that? For example, people who hate God or despise
Mhm.
God.
Yes, I think so, um, because hate and anger, when they're used correctly and effectively, are enormously powerful. Because anger is, the world is not the way I want it to be. Right? It can be a motivator to help repair the world. Um, Saying, I hate God because such and such happened in my life, that can be enormously powerful, because I need to be able to create some healing in this relationship or in myself. So I think absolutely. I think ultimately, um, how we think and talk about God is is very much influenced by our personal experience.
What the absence of awe and wonder? So, for apathy, if someone felt apathy, could they also use that as a relation to God?
Um, so there's a line in that's a I think it was Elie Wiesel who said um, that if you love God or if you hate God, I know that God says, I know that you love me, but if you sit back in the I don't care, then I created you in vain. I think apathy can be very problematic, um, and not because of any theological pieces, although I think it does. I think apathy would prevent any connection with God, but it prevents you from engaging in the world. Um, and I think if there's apathy, um, then you're not living the full life that you want to be living. Right? I'm a big believer in therapy. I think because I think it's enormously helpful. I think because it helps people think about and talk about what's keeping them back. Are they acting in the way they want to be acting? Are they moving in a direction they want to be moving in? And so if there's apathy there, it may be um, something that would need to be talked about and addressed through somebody who has a more professional capacity to talk about that.
So, what do you think about, for example, Buddhism or Stoicism, where they try to uh, like ostracize themselves from those more visceral emotions, and they try to achieve that sense of kind of just calmness?
So calmness is not apathy, right? Calmness is not, and accepting the negative is not apathy. I actually find that to be enormously valuable. I did meditation before I had little kids, and now I don't. I used to do, but I usually about a 45-minute meditation every morning, and I think actually a level of stoicism can be enormously valuable, and being able to know what's the worst that's going to happen, and okay, can I handle it, and what would I do if that does happen? I think that's tremendously helpful.
So what if we go from the other direction and say someone who wants to essentially destroy the world or something like Hitler or Stalin, or whether they wanted to destroy the world or not, would they also have a connection to God in the same sense, or would they be trying to go the other way in some sense?
So there's a few different elements of this that I want to tease out, and I want to be careful about as much as I can to talk about this. Um, One is what's the internal drive to be able to do it, right? So communism tried to eliminate religion and God, right? So that was their description to be able to do that. And so I also strongly believe that very few people act in ways that they themselves think are bad. So now they ultimately, the impact might be very bad, but thinking about um, and hopefully this is the way it comes off the way I intended to. Hitler and the Nazis and ordinary Germans, I don't think we're going in saying, you know what, I want to destroy the world here. I want the world to be awful. I want it to be terrible. I think they thought they were making the world better for themselves and their community. I think that was their internal logic. The impact ended up being horrific for the Jewish community, for the world as a whole. So I think that there's a line in Jewish tradition that says that how we act is reflective of God. And if somebody were to say, look how righteous I am, and they defraud other people, that's bad for the person and it's bad for God, because if you're doing horrible things in the name of God, that's really terrible. And yet if there's somebody who says, if somebody is kind and giving and compassionate, that brings more of God into this world. And so did Hitler or Stalin have a relationship or a connection to God? I don't know. I would have to ask them. I don't want to actually ask them, and I can't because they're dead. But I think that their impact brought less of God into this world.
So how would you interpret someone who does essentially just want to destroy the world and hates everything?
What about them?
Like what is their relationship to God in the sense that you've described it?
Um, well, I would need to know what their thought of God is. I would need to know why they articulate that they want to watch the world burn, right? If you quote Dark Knight,
Yeah.
that's because I don't know of anyone who would articulate it in that way, right? Unless they are very, in need of very serious psychological help, in which case I would hope they would get the psychological help they would need. But I don't think that's how people act. I think they in Judaism, the idea is that you miss the mark, right? You're trying to do something and you're trying to hit the mark and you miss it, right? The way that we hurt other people, very rarely are we saying, I'm going to make someone else's life difficult here. Mwahahaha. Right? You may end up making their life difficult, and it may have been the right decision on that, but you're doing it because you think it's the right thing to be able to do. But then there are times when you might say, you know what, I really messed up, or this had this impact in this kind of way. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's it as best I can get.
So what's your perspective on animals? Do they also have a connection to God in the same way that we do, like chimpanzees or other social mammals?
For me, not as much, in large part because of um, what humans are able to do and that animals are not able to do. And yet I think there is a responsibility to be able to protect their rights and well-being and not inflict pain on them.
So what do
So,
you mean by the stuff that they can do or that we can do that they can't do, and how does that
uh,
relate to the relationship to a God?
particularly language and culture, in my mind, those are uniquely human gifts.
And so the fact that they don't have those makes they don't have as strong a connection to God in
They
your
don't,
sense.
they don't have the language to talk about God. They may, and again, they may, and again, in the same way that I can't talk with an alien, I can't get into the mind of a goldfish or a dog. But I would think they certainly do not have the ability to talk about it in the way that we human beings do.
That's interesting. So what else, like from what would you consider to be, because the atheist perspective says there is no God.
Mm-hmm.
How would you interpret that from your perspective?
So I think there are a couple of different things. One would be tell me about the God that you don't believe in, which is something a lot of rabbis say. And my guess is that the God that you were describing is not a God that I would believe in. I would say, are you an atheist or are you an anti-theist? Right? Do you not believe there is a God, or do you not want there to be a God? Right? Those are different kinds of questions there. And so and then so that's where that conversation would start. That's at least where I would initiate that.
All right. So, for example, the atheist, like Richard Dawkins, or someone who says there is only the natural world and matter and energy and motion, therefore there is no God. Would you disagree with his statement?
I would disagree with that statement. Yes, because there would say there is no God. There is no God as described that you are talking about and fighting against. Right on that level, I think you can make a legitimate argument that science and the natural world make it difficult, if not impossible, to believe in one specific version of God that some people believe in, right? But it is that particular version of God that is very different than what my conception of God is about.
So, would you agree with his overall statement that there's essentially all that there is matter and energy and motion, essentially all that we know about?
That would I would for me I would accept that statement, but I don't accept that therefore there is no God. Right? I accept the first part, but not the second part, and I don't accept the second part, and I also don't accept the logical leap there.
So, have you ever had questioned your own faith or had doubts about your faith?
Um, that's a good question. So I'm bumping up against the word faith because that's not a word that I use. That's generally not a Jewish word because it's not a question of belief for me. Um, I've had to think through my challenge that I still grapple with that I still have not totally resolved for me is I I for me and I'm moving away from this, but I do think that humans are unique and that humans do have a unique relationship with God, separate from other animals. That's where I am right now. Where I struggle with that is that I see evolution as a process, and which would, if there is a qualitative difference um, between humans and other animals, it would imply, okay, this did not have a relationship with God, and this did, and evolution doesn't work that way. Evolution is a process. Like, oh, it was this Homo genus that was in southern Africa, 275,432 BCE or whatever. Like so I struggle with that, but and my view on God has changed and grown a little bit and been fleshed out, um, but I've never not felt the connection to God.
Okay. Do you think that when the Torah says that the Mosaic law comes from God, what exactly does that mean?
Again, I think to me it is a human attempt to be able to understand God.
Okay. And are you awaiting a Messiah, as in the Torah says that there's going to be a Messiah? Is that something that?
I laugh because there's a book I love called "There Is No Messiah and You're It." So as I identify from a more liberal perspective of Judaism, so I am not waiting for a particular one Messiah. I am I'm much more of a believer that we make incremental better changes. Let's make tomorrow better than today. Um, and next year better than this year. And so that's where I come from. So I'm not waiting for one particular Messiah to come in.
And you said this was a minority viewpoint. Do you think that like most Jews would see this differently in some way?
No, I would say most Jews on the street would buy into this. But it's um I would venture to guess that most Jews, more traditional Jews, may differ on this, but I think most Jews are not thinking about the Messiah at all. And by the way, the Messiah is different in Judaism than in Christianity. I think that's also an important distinction.
Yeah, it's
So
not Jesus. They don't believe in Jesus, right?
right, right. The Messiah is a job description that was very specific in Judaism at a certain time that changed and developed as Christianity developed. So
Have you read the Synoptic Gospels, and what are your thoughts on them?
I have as sort of an academic. Um, I find them very interesting. it's, and again, I think they were in the same way that the Torah was written in a particular time and place for particular reasons, trying to get particular messages. But they've also got to be situated in their time and place in the same way that every part of the Torah has to be as well.
Interesting. Well, I think that covers all the questions I had for you. That was a really interesting conversation. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
No, this was a lot of fun. I enjoyed talking about this, and you asked some really really good questions.
Thank you. Yeah, this was really fun. I really enjoyed it. You have a very interesting perspective that I've never heard before, and I'm fascinated by it. It's a really interesting way to look at the world that I haven't thought about, and I'm glad to have really had the time to talk with you. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to know sort of what you're thinking now. Sort of as I'm curious as to anything that's percolating in your mind.
Well, from my perspective, I wouldn't disagree with anything that you said for the most part. We just use different language to describe the same thing, which is just essentially a reality or existence as it is. And we're not violating essentially Occam's razor to add anything extra that isn't already there as far as we know. So, from your perspective, I would essentially agree with your worldview, just disagree with your language usage, and that's it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that I try and
Oh, I think he.
I joked. I'm very comfortable talking with atheists, and a lot of people are like, oh, wait, if that's what religion really was, I wouldn't be so like this is not something that scares me in the way that for others it does.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, so what's the next step then here?
Next step for what?
Oh, you there? Oh,
Can you hear me?
yeah. So are you gonna uh yep.
I think there's a delay.
Nope,
What?
you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yep. A little bit?
Yes,
Yes.
I think there's a delay. I think there's something at the internet going on.
Oh, I don't know what's going on.
Uh,
Oh yeah, no, I can hear you okay. Yeah.
yeah, I think there's a really big delay. I think there's something that's going on. Chat. See if you can read the chat.
Oh, oh, you're going. So we'll email.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. All right. Yeah, thanks
Here,
again for coming
let me
on.
leave and then come back in.
Yeah, try that. Try that for sure. Yeah, it looks like that'll be it. I think there was technical difficulties. Not sure what happened there at the end, but thanks guys for coming on. It was a fun conversation. I'll talk to you guys later.